My daughter-in-law Jessica told me I was a confused old woman living in the past, so she threw my husband's ashes in the garbage like he was nothing more than dirt. But I wasn't confused about what I was planning, something that would make her realize that some fires never die. They just wait for the right moment to burn everything down. This is how I made the woman who destroyed my most precious possession watch her perfect little world crumble piece by piece. And trust me, she never saw it coming. See, people think that when you're 73 and your hands shake a little when you pour your morning coffee, that you've lost your edge. They think grief makes you weak, that loneliness makes you desperate for any scrap of family attention. Jessica certainly thought that. She looked at me and saw a broken old lady who would be grateful for whatever crumbs of respect she decided to throw my way. She saw someone whose opinion didn't matter, whose feelings were inconvenient, whose very existence was something to be managed rather than respected. If you've ever been underestimated because of your age, if you've ever had someone treat you like you don't matter anymore, then subscribe to this channel, because what I did next is going to show you that sometimes the quietest people are just planning the loudest revenge. Sometimes the woman they think is harmless is actually the most dangerous person in the room. And Jessica learned that lesson in the most devastating way possible. Let me tell you about Harold first, because you need to understand what she destroyed, to understand why what I did was perfectly justified. Harold wasn't just my husband, he was my partner, in every sense of the word, the foundation of everything good in my life. Harold and I were married for 48 years. We met when I was 22, and he was 24, both of us working at the textile mill in town. I was running the fabric inspection line, checking every yard for flaws, and he was in maintenance, keeping the ancient machinery running with nothing but skill and determination. Every day for 3 months, he found excuses to check the machinery near my station, the motor that didn't really need adjusting, the belt that was running just fine, the oil levels that he'd already checked twice that morning. Finally, I told him if he was going to keep staring, he might as well ask me to dinner. He turned red as a beet and stammered out an invitation to the little diner on Main Street. We had meatloaf and mashed potatoes and talked until they turned off the lights and practically threw us out. We didn't have much money in those early years, but we had dreams, and we had each other. Harold worked double shifts to save for our wedding, coming home exhausted but always with energy to talk about our future. I took in sewing at night to help pay for my dress, squinting over tiny stitches by lamplight, my fingers bleeding from needle pricks. We lived in a tiny apartment above Mrs. Morrison's bakery, and the smell of fresh bread became the scent of our first year of marriage. Every morning I'd wake up to that warm, yeasty smell and Harold's arm around my waist, and I thought I was the luckiest woman in the world. When our son David was born, Harold worked 3 jobs to move us into a real house with a yard where our boy could play. He'd come home from his shift at the mill, grab a quick dinner, and head out to his evening job at Miller's Garage. Weekends he worked construction, mixing concrete and hauling lumber, until his hands were raw and his back ached so bad he could barely stand straight. I remember watching him come home at midnight, his hands black with grease from the garage where he worked weekends, his work clothes stiff with sawdust and concrete dust, and he'd still get up at 5 to spend an hour with the baby before heading back to the mill. Harold never missed one of David's baseball games, even when he was pulling those double shifts. He'd show up still in his work clothes, motor oil under his fingernails and exhaustion in his eyes, but cheering louder than any other parent in those bleachers. When David struck out, Harold would tell him it was just practice for the next hit. When David made a good play, Harold would beam like our boy had just won the World Series. Other fathers came to games in suits after office jobs, but David always knew his father was the one who worked hardest to be there. When David wanted to go to college, Harold took on weekend construction work for 2 years to help pay the tuition. His back was never the same after that, but he never complained. Investment in the boy's future, he'd say, rubbing his spine after those long days swinging a hammer. I'd see him lying on the living room floor at night, trying to stretch out the knots, and I'd want to tell him it was enough, that David could get loans or work his way through school. But Harold was determined that his son would have every opportunity he'd never had. We sacrificed everything for David. And I mean everything. Family vacations were day trips to the lake because we put every extra dollar into his education fund. I wore the same 3 dresses for years, altering them when styles changed, taking them in and letting them out, changing the buttons and the trim to make them look new. David's school supplies and sports equipment came first, always. Harold drove a truck that was 15 years old and held together with prayer and spare parts. But David always had what he needed. New cleats when his feet grew, a graphing calculator for advanced math, a class ring that cost more than Harold spent on clothes in a year. I watched Harold's hair go gray and his shoulders stoop from all that work, but he never lost his pride in providing for us. He'd look at David's report cards like they were treasure maps, pointing out every A and talking about the bright future our son was going to have. College graduate, he'd say with wonder, like David was going to be the first person to walk on Mars. Harold himself had dropped out of high school to help support his family, and seeing David succeed academically was better than any reward he could have imagined for himself. When David got engaged to Jessica, Harold was so proud you'd have thought he'd personally arranged the match. "Our boy found himself a real lady," he said after meeting her for the first time. Jessica was beautiful, polished, everything Harold thought David deserved. She had a college degree and worked at a bank, wore expensive clothes, and spoke with perfect grammar. She knew about wine and art and all the sophisticated things Harold felt he'd never been able to give David. Harold bought a new suit for their wedding, the first new clothes he'd purchased for himself in 5 years, and he looked so handsome walking David down that aisle. But I noticed things Harold didn't want to see, or maybe couldn't let himself see. The way Jessica smiled with her mouth but not her eyes, when Harold told his stories about the old days at the mill, how she checked her phone constantly during family dinners, like our conversation was just an interruption in her real life. The way she steered David away from spending too much time with us, always having some important social event they needed to attend instead. Some benefit dinner, or gallery opening, or party with her work friends. Harold made excuses for her. "She's young," he'd say. "She'll warm up to us. Takes time to feel like family." I wanted to believe that too, but a mother's instincts are different from a father's hopes. I saw how Jessica looked at our house, at our furniture, at the life Harold and I had built together. She didn't see a home filled with love and memories. She saw poverty and embarrassment. She didn't see a man who'd worked himself to the bone for his family. She saw someone who hadn't achieved the kind of success she valued. Jessica came from money, real money, the kind where your father owns a business instead of working for one. She'd grown up with maids and private schools and summer houses, and I think she viewed Harold and me as obstacles David needed to overcome rather than parents he should honor. After they married, the visits became less frequent and more strained. Phone calls got shorter and less personal. Jessica was always busy with her career, her friends, her perfect social life that apparently had no room for elderly in-laws who embarrassed her. David started making excuses for why they couldn't come for Sunday dinner. "Jessica's tired from work. Jessica has plans with her college friends. Jessica thinks we should have more couple time." Harold would set 4 places out of habit, then quietly put 2 away when I reminded him they weren't coming, and I'd see the disappointment in his eyes that he tried so hard to hide. The holidays were the worst. Jessica would arrive late and leave early, spending most of her time texting or taking phone calls in the other room. She'd bring expensive gifts that felt more like obligations than expressions of love, a fancy coffee maker we didn't need, designer towels that were too nice to actually use. Meanwhile, Harold would give David some small, handmade gift, like a wooden jewelry box he'd crafted in the garage, or a photo album filled with pictures from David's childhood. Jessica would barely glance at Harold's gifts, but I could see how much thought and love went into everyone. When Harold started getting sick, really sick, I called David to tell him his father needed him. It was a Tuesday evening in November, and Harold had just gotten back from the doctor with results that made my blood run cold. The doctor had used words like aggressive and advanced and limited time, and I knew David needed to hear this from me, not from some phone call weeks later. Jessica answered the phone on the second ring. "David's at a client dinner," she said in that brisk professional tone she used when she was being efficiently dismissive. "I'll have him call you back." He never did. I called 3 more times that week, each time getting Jessica with a different excuse. David was working late. David was out of town on business. David was too busy to talk, but would call when he had time. By the 4th call, I could hear the irritation in her voice. "Eleanor, is this really urgent? Because David has a lot on his plate right now with his promotion coming up." Urgent. My husband was dying, and she wanted to know if it was urgent. Harold lasted 6 months after the diagnosis. Lung cancer, aggressive and merciless, the kind that takes a strong man and reduces him to shadow and pain. I became his full-time caregiver, learning to manage oxygen tanks and morphine schedules and all the terrible machinery that keeps someone alive when their body wants to give up. I learned to read the signs of good days and bad days, to calculate medications and monitor breathing, and pretend I wasn't terrified every single moment that I was going to lose the love of my life. The nights were the hardest. Harold would wake up gasping, confused and frightened, and I'd hold his hand and talk him through the fear. I'd tell him stories about our early days, about David's childhood, about all the good memories we'd built together. Sometimes he'd forget where he was or what year it was, but he never forgot that he loved me. Even at the very end, when the pain medication made everything else fuzzy, he'd look at me with those blue eyes and whisper, "My Eleanor, my beautiful Eleanor." David came to see his father exactly twice during those 6 months. The first time was right after the diagnosis, when even Jessica couldn't argue that a cancer diagnosis warranted a visit. David looked shocked at how thin Harold had gotten, how the disease had already begun its work of stealing him away from us. He stayed for 3 hours, mostly sitting beside Harold's bed, looking uncomfortable and scared. Harold was so happy to see him, kept talking about David's job and Jessica's career, like his son was the most successful person in the world. The second visit was 2 weeks before Harold died, and only happened because I called David myself and told him point blank that if he wanted to say goodbye to his father, he needed to come now. David arrived alone, without Jessica, and I was grateful for that small mercy. Father and son had an hour together while I busied myself in the kitchen, giving them privacy for whatever needed to be said. When David left, Harold was exhausted, but peaceful. "Good boy," he said to me. "Always was a good boy. Just got a little lost, that's all." Jessica came once, stayed for 20 minutes, and spent most of that time outside on her phone. She claimed it was a work emergency, but I could hear her through the window talking about dinner reservations and weekend plans. When she finally came inside, she looked at Harold with barely concealed disgust. The cancer had ravaged his body by then, and I think seeing him so diminished offended her sense of aesthetics. She made small talk for a few minutes, checking her watch repeatedly, then announced she had to leave for another appointment. After she left, Harold was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "She doesn't like me much, does she? She doesn't understand you," I said, which was the kindest way I could put it. "David chose her," Harold said simply. "So she must have good qualities I can't see." That was Harold. Even dying, even being treated with such coldness by his daughter-in-law, he was still making excuses for her behavior because he loved his son and wanted to believe David had chosen well. The day Harold died, I held his hand and promised him I'd keep his memory alive. I promised I'd make sure David remembered the father who sacrificed everything for him, who worked 3 jobs and ruined his health and never once complained about the cost of loving his family. Harold had asked to be cremated, and he wanted his ashes kept in the oak box he'd made himself in the garage workshop. It was simple, beautiful work, sanded smooth and finished with the same care he put into everything he built. He'd made it 2 years before he got sick, during one of his weekend woodworking sessions, telling me it was just a practice project but keeping it on the shelf like it might be needed someday. For 2 years after Harold's death, that box sat on the mantel in our living room, right where Harold had wanted it. Every morning I'd make my coffee and sit in Harold's chair and tell him about my day. I'd read him parts of the newspaper, especially the sports section, since he'd always loved baseball. I'd tell him about the neighbors, about what was growing in the garden, about how much I missed hearing his voice and feeling his hand in mine. David visited maybe 6 times in those 2 years, and each time Jessica would glance at the box with obvious discomfort. She never said anything directly, but I caught her whispering to David about how unhealthy it was for me to keep remains in the house. She'd use words like morbid and concerning and suggest that I was unable to process grief in a healthy way. She'd researched articles about widow's grief and complicated mourning, printing them out and leaving them strategically where I'd find them. I knew Jessica wanted Harold's ashes gone, but I thought it was just her discomfort with death and grief. I didn't realize yet that Harold's presence, even in death, was inconvenient for the narrative she was building about David's life. She wanted David to forget where he came from, to embrace her version of success and sophistication without the constant reminder of his working-class father who'd sacrificed everything for his son's future. Then David got a promotion that required them to move across the country to Seattle. Better job, more money, the kind of opportunity Harold would have been so proud to see his son achieve. But instead of celebrating with me, David and Jessica immediately began pressuring me to sell the house and move into a retirement community. "It would be good for you, Mom," David said during one of his increasingly rare visits. "You'd have people to talk to, activities, medical care right there if you need it." Jessica nodded enthusiastically, already scrolling through fancy facilities on her tablet, showing me pictures of smiling seniors playing bingo and doing watercolor painting. "Look at this place," Jessica said, turning her screen toward me. "Sunset Manor has a full medical staff, organized activities, transportation to shopping, and appointments. You'd never have to worry about maintaining this big house or being alone if something happened." I wasn't ready to leave the house Harold and I had shared for 45 years. Every room held memories that I wasn't prepared to abandon. The kitchen where we'd shared thousands of meals, where Harold had taught David to scramble eggs and flip pancakes. The bedroom where we'd held each other through good times and bad, where we'd whispered our dreams and fears and plans for the future. The backyard where Harold had taught David to throw a baseball, where we'd planted our first garden and watched it grow alongside our marriage. This wasn't just a house. It was our life's work, the physical manifestation of everything Harold and I had built together. Every improvement, every repair, every coat of paint represented years of our lives, dreams we'd shared, goals we'd achieved together. The thought of strangers living here, of some developer tearing it down to build something modern and soulless, felt like a betrayal of everything Harold and I had worked for. But they kept pushing, and the pressure campaign was relentless and sophisticated. David called every few days with new arguments about why I needed supervised care. Jessica found articles about elderly people living alone and the dangers they faced: falls, medical emergencies, cognitive decline, financial scams. They painted a picture of me as a confused old woman, unable to care for herself, despite the fact that I managed my own finances, maintained the house, and drove myself to appointments and grocery stores without any problems. Jessica became particularly concerned about my social isolation, despite the fact that I had friends at church, neighbors I talked to regularly, and a book club that met twice a month. She worried about my nutritional needs, even though I cooked healthy meals and maintained the same weight I'd had for 20 years. She fretted about my cognitive health, pointing to normal senior moments like forgetting where I'd put my reading glasses as evidence of serious decline. The pressure campaign lasted 3 months, with escalating urgency and increasingly dire predictions about what would happen to me if I continued living alone. Finally, I agreed to visit one facility, just to get them to stop pestering me, and to prove that I could make rational decisions about my own care. Sunset Manor was nice enough, I suppose. Clean rooms with neutral decor, organized activities led by cheerful young staff members, nurses available around the clock for any medical needs. The residents seemed content, playing cards and watching movies and participating in crafts that reminded me of elementary school art projects. But it felt like a warehouse for people waiting to die, a place where days were scheduled and managed rather than lived. The residents shuffled through their days following schedules someone else created, eating meals someone else planned, living lives that had been safely sanitized of any real meaning or purpose. David and Jessica were thrilled that I'd even looked at the place. They immediately started planning my transition, as they called it, like I was some kind of corporate merger that needed to be managed efficiently. Jessica researched moving companies and storage facilities, calculating costs and timelines with the kind of precision she brought to her banking work. David talked about putting the house on the market, while the real estate market was hot, already envisioning the profits from our family home. They had my entire life boxed up and distributed before I'd even agreed to move. Harold's workshop would be cleared out, his tools sold or donated. The garden we'd tended together would be someone else's responsibility. The memories embedded in every corner of our home would be packed away or discarded as clutter that wouldn't fit in a single-room facility. I felt like I was watching my own death, the systematic dismantling of everything that made my life meaningful. But I agreed to try a month at Sunset Manor, thinking that maybe if I proved I could adapt to their plan, they'd stop treating me like an incompetent child who couldn't make her own decisions. That's when Jessica made her fatal mistake, the one that transformed me from a grieving widow into someone capable of methodical, devastating revenge. I'd agreed to a trial month at Sunset Manor, just to see how it felt, and to appease David and Jessica's concerns about my living situation. They were helping me pack some essentials, and I was moving slowly, trying to decide what I could take and what would have to stay behind, temporarily. I was in the bedroom, carefully folding Harold's favorite sweater to pack with me, a soft blue cardigan he'd worn every Sunday for church, when I heard Jessica's voice from the living room. Her tone was different when she thought I couldn't hear her, sharper and more authoritative than the patient, condescending voice she used when talking to me directly. "We need to deal with that box," she was saying to David. "I'm not having visitors come into my mother-in-law's room and see a dead person sitting on her dresser. It's morbid and frankly disturbing. What are people going to think?" "It's just for a month," David replied, but his voice was weak, uncertain. Even he could hear how callous Jessica sounded. "David, your mother needs to move forward with her life," Jessica continued, her voice taking on the professional tone she used when she was explaining banking procedures to customers who didn't understand financial products. "Keeping those ashes is keeping her stuck in the past. It's not healthy for her, and it's certainly not healthy for us when people ask questions about why your mother carries around your father's remains like some kind of shrine." I crept closer to the doorway to listen, my heart starting to pound with a combination of disbelief and growing rage. "What do you suggest we do?" David asked, and I could hear the defeat in his voice. This wasn't the first time they'd had this conversation. "We dispose of them appropriately," Jessica said matter-of-factly, like she was discussing taking out the garbage. "I researched it online. There's a crematorium outside of town that handles these situations. They have a communal garden where unclaimed remains are scattered. Very peaceful, very dignified. Your father would finally be at rest instead of sitting in a box on a shelf like some kind of decoration. My heart stopped. She was talking about throwing Harold away like garbage, and she was using words like peaceful and dignified to dress up her cruelty. I don't know, Jess, David said weakly. Those ashes mean everything to Mom. It's all she has left of him. Your mother is confused and grieving, Jessica replied with the kind of patience adults use when explaining obvious things to children. She can't make rational decisions right now. That's why she needs us to make the hard choices for her. David, we're doing this out of love. Sometimes love means making difficult decisions for people who can't make them for themselves. Love. She was calling this love. But what if she finds out? David asked. What if she asks where they are? We'll tell her they've been properly laid to rest, Jessica said smoothly. Which is the truth. She'll be upset for a few days, but then she'll realize we did the right thing. David, your mother is clinging to death instead of embracing life. We're helping her move forward. I heard movement, footsteps coming toward the bedroom. I quickly went back to my packing, but my hands were shaking with rage, and my mind was reeling from what I'd just heard. Jessica appeared in the doorway, that fake smile plastered on her face like a mask. Eleanor, we've decided it would be best if your husband's ashes were laid to rest properly. There's a beautiful memorial garden where he can finally be at peace. I want to keep them with me, I said quietly, testing to see how far she was willing to push this. I know you think you do, Jessica replied in that condescending tone she used when she thought she was being patient with a difficult child. But the facility has policies about personal items, and frankly, it's time to let go. Harold wouldn't want you clinging to his remains like this. He'd want you to move forward with your life. David stood behind her looking uncomfortable but not contradicting his wife. My own son, standing there while his wife planned to throw his father away like trash. The box stays with me, I said more firmly, making my voice stronger to see how she'd respond. Jessica's fake smile faltered, and for a moment I saw the real woman underneath the polished exterior. Eleanor, you're not thinking clearly. We've already made arrangements with the crematorium. This is what's best for everyone. Harold is my husband, I said, standing up from where I'd been kneeling by the suitcase. Those are his remains. You have no right. Actually, Jessica interrupted, her voice turning cold and professional. David is your power of attorney for healthcare decisions, and we've consulted with the facility's social worker. She agrees that keeping human remains in your living space is contraindicated for healthy grief processing. It's preventing you from moving through the stages of grief appropriately. Power of attorney for healthcare decisions. I'd signed those papers years ago, back when it seemed like a reasonable precaution in case I ever became too ill to make my own medical decisions. I never imagined they'd be used as a weapon against me, twisted into something that would let them make decisions about my husband's remains. The box doesn't leave this house, I said, my voice getting stronger as my anger built. Yes, it does, Jessica replied firmly, dropping all pretense of patience. Today. We're taking care of this now, so you don't have to worry about it anymore. David, get the box. That's when I realized what was really happening. They weren't trying to help me process grief or move forward with my life. Jessica wanted Harold's ashes gone because they reminded everyone that David had a father who loved him before she came along. Harold's presence, even in death, was inconvenient for the narrative Jessica was building about their perfect life together. She wanted to erase the past, to rewrite David's history so it started with her instead of with the man who'd raised him and shaped him into the person she'd fallen in love with. No, I said, stepping between David and the living room. Eleanor, David said gently, we're just trying to help. This isn't healthy for you. You're trying to erase your father, I replied, looking directly at my son and letting him see the disappointment and anger in my eyes. This is all that's left of the man who worked 3 jobs to pay for your college, the man who taught you to drive, who came to every game, who sacrificed his health and his comfort and his dreams to give you a good life, And you're gonna let her throw him away because it makes her uncomfortable." David's face flushed red, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. Part of him knew this was wrong, but he'd gotten so used to letting Jessica make decisions that he couldn't find the strength to stand up to her. "Mom, that's not fair," he said weakly. "What's not fair is abandoning your father twice," I said, my voice rising with all the anger and grief I'd been holding back for months. "Once when he was dying and needed you, and again now that he's dead and can't defend himself." Jessica's composure finally cracked completely. "That's enough," she snapped, her voice sharp and ugly. "David, get the box. We're handling this now, and I don't want to hear another word about it." And that's what they did. Despite my protests, despite my tears, despite my begging them to reconsider, David picked up his father's oak box, the box Harold had made with his own hands, sanded smooth and finished with love, and carried it out to Jessica's car. Jessica informed me that they would take care of the arrangements, and that I shouldn't worry about the details. They drove away with Harold's ashes, and I stood in my empty living room, staring at the spot on the mantel where my husband had been, feeling like they'd robbed me all over again. They thought I was a confused old woman who would cry for a few days and then forget about it. They thought grief had made me weak and desperate for their approval. They thought I would accept this violation because I needed them more than they needed me, because I was old and alone and had no other family to turn to. They were wrong about everything, but especially about how much fight I had left in me. I didn't move to Sunset Manor that month. I called David 2 days after they took Harold's ashes and told him I'd changed my mind, that I needed more time to think about the transition. He was disappointed but didn't argue too strenuously. Jessica was furious, but she couldn't force me to move if I didn't want to, not without going through a lengthy legal process to have me declared incompetent. Instead, I spent that month doing research, the kind of thorough, methodical research that Harold had taught me to do whenever I was facing an important decision. I learned everything I could about power of attorney laws, about property rights, about what Jessica and David had actually done when they took Harold's ashes without my consent. I learned about elder abuse, about financial exploitation, about legal protections for seniors that I'd never known existed. Most importantly, I learned that Harold's ashes were legally my property, and taking them without my consent was theft, regardless of what Jessica claimed about power of attorney or healthcare decisions. Cremated remains aren't medical equipment or medication. They're personal property, and stealing someone's personal property is a crime. I also spent time going through Harold's papers that Jessica and David had never bothered to examine because they assumed there was nothing of value to find. Harold had been a careful man, a thorough man, who kept meticulous records of everything important. Tax returns going back decades, filed in chronological order. Insurance policies, updated regularly and kept in a fireproof box. Investment statements that showed decades of careful saving and conservative investing. Property deeds and mortgage records and warranty information for every major purchase we'd ever made. And most importantly, Harold's will, properly witnessed and notarized, filed with our attorney, and kept in a safety deposit box at the bank. Harold's will was very specific about his final wishes. He wanted to be cremated, and he wanted his ashes kept in the oak box he'd made himself. He wanted me to keep them for as long as I lived, and when I died, he wanted our ashes mixed together and scattered in the backyard of our first house, the little place we'd rented when David was a baby. Harold had even included a letter explaining his reasoning, talking about how much he loved our early years together, and how he wanted our final resting place to be where our life as a family had really begun. Jessica and David had violated Harold's explicit final wishes. They'd committed theft, and they'd done it using a healthcare power of attorney for a situation that had absolutely nothing to do with healthcare. I called a lawyer. Robert Henley was recommended by Mrs. Patterson from church. She'd used him when her nephew tried to take advantage of her after her husband died, draining her checking account and forging her signature on loan documents. Robert was young, maybe 40, but he had kind eyes and he didn't talk down to me like I was an addled old woman who couldn't understand complex legal concepts. "Mrs. Morton," he said after I'd explained the situation in detail, "what your son and daughter-in-law did was theft, pure and simple. They had no legal right to take your husband's remains, regardless of what they claim about power of attorney or facility policies. Can we get them back?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Possibly," Robert said carefully. "But first, we need to determine what they actually did with the remains. Have they told you where Harold's ashes are now?" I shook my head. "Jessica said they would handle the arrangements, but they haven't given me any details. Every time I ask David, he changes the subject or says I should focus on moving forward instead of looking backward." Robert made detailed notes as I talked. "We'll start with a formal demand letter requiring them to return the remains immediately or provide legal documentation of what was done with them. We'll also be filing a complaint for theft of property and violation of the deceased's final wishes." "What if they've already scattered the ashes somewhere?" I asked, voicing my worst fear. "Then we move to financial damages and punitive measures," Robert said firmly. "We calculate the value of the property they destroyed, the emotional distress they caused, and any other damages we can document. Mrs. Morton, I want you to understand that this isn't just about the ashes, as important as they are to you. What they did is part of a pattern of elder abuse and financial exploitation." "Financial exploitation?" I asked, confused. "Think about it," Robert said, leaning forward. "They used coercion and false claims about your mental capacity to pressure you into moving to a facility, which would have given them immediate access to your house and all your assets. They stole property that belonged to you, using fraudulent claims about legal authority. They violated your deceased husband's final wishes. If we look deeper into their behavior, I suspect we'll find other concerning patterns." Robert was right, and over the next few weeks, as we dug into David and Jessica's actions over the past few years, a disturbing pattern emerged. Jessica had been gradually isolating me from my son, limiting our contact and controlling the flow of information between us. She'd been pressuring David to get me declared mentally incompetent so they could take over my finances. She'd been researching my assets, my insurance policies, my property values, preparing for the day when she could gain control of everything Harold and I had worked for. I'd kept all the documents from when they were pressuring me to move to Sunset Manor, and Robert found them very revealing. Jessica had researched not just the facility, but also the legal procedures for taking control of an elderly person's finances. She'd printed out articles about guardianship proceedings and conservatorship laws. She'd even contacted a realtor about the potential value of my house, claiming she was helping her mother-in-law explore her options. "Mrs. Morton," Robert said during our third meeting, spreading the documents across his desk like evidence in a criminal trial. "Your daughter-in-law has been planning this for years. The ashes were just the first step in a comprehensive plan to strip you of your autonomy, your property, and your dignity. I had no idea she was capable of something like this," I said, staring at the evidence of Jessica's deception. "Predators are often very skilled at hiding their intentions," Robert replied. "They target people who are vulnerable, widowed, isolated, trusting. They use family relationships to gain access and authority, and they count on their victims being too ashamed or too confused to fight back." "What can we do about it?" I asked. "We fight back," Robert said with determination. "And we make sure she understands that stealing from seniors has serious, life-changing consequences." Robert sent the demand letter on a Thursday afternoon. It was 3 pages of formal legal language that boiled down to a simple message: return Harold's ashes within 5 business days, or provide legal documentation of their disposal, and be prepared to face both criminal and civil consequences for theft and elder abuse. Jessica called me that same evening, and her voice was shaking with fury. "Eleanor, what do you think you're doing?" she demanded without even bothering with a greeting. "David is devastated that you would threaten your own son with legal action over this nonsense." "Where are Harold's ashes?" I asked calmly, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "They've been properly laid to rest, which is what should have happened 2 years ago, when any reasonable person would have accepted reality." "Where?" I pressed. "That's not important anymore," Jessica said dismissively. "What's important is that you're damaging your relationship with your son over something that doesn't matter to anyone but you. It matters to me, and it mattered to Harold, and it should matter to David." "Harold is dead," Jessica snapped, her composure completely gone now. "He doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that David and I are trying to build a life together, and we can't do that with you clinging to the past and making unreasonable demands about dead people." There it was, the truth finally out in the open, spoken in her own voice. "Harold doesn't matter anymore," I repeated slowly, making sure I understood exactly what she was saying. "No, he doesn't," Jessica said with brutal honesty. "David has moved on. I've helped him move on from all that blue-collar nonsense and small-town thinking. And you need to move on too, or you're going to lose the only family you have left." "I see," I said quietly. "I hope you do see," Jessica continued, her voice taking on a threatening edge. "Call off your lawyer, and we can forget this whole thing happened. Keep acting like a crazy old woman, and you'll find yourself very alone. David doesn't need a mother who causes drama and makes legal threats. He can build a perfectly good life without you in it." I hung up the phone and immediately called Robert to report the conversation. "Mrs. Morton," he said when he heard my voice. "How did they respond to the letter?" "She admitted they destroyed the ashes," I said, my voice steady despite the emotions raging inside me. "And she just threatened to cut off contact with my son if I don't drop the legal action." "Perfect," Robert said with satisfaction. "That's extortion, on top of everything else. Mrs. Morton, would you be willing to record your phone conversations with them? In this state, it's legal as long as one party to the conversation consents." "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I'll record everything." Over the next 2 weeks, Jessica called me 6 more times, and each conversation was more revealing and more damaging than the last. I recorded every word, and the recordings painted a picture of a woman who was calculating, manipulative, and completely without remorse for what she'd done. In the first call, she tried guilt and manipulation, talking about how much David loved me and how I was forcing him to choose between his wife and his mother. "You're tearing this family apart over a box of dust," she said. "Is that really how you want to be remembered?" In the second call, she tried to bargain, offering to take me on a memorial trip to scatter some generic ashes in a place that would be meaningful to Harold. "We can create new memories," she said. "Better memories that aren't so morbid and depressing." In the third call, she got angry and admitted that they'd thrown Harold's ashes in a dumpster behind the crematorium because paying for disposal was a waste of money for someone nobody cared about anymore. She said it like she was talking about old furniture or broken appliances, not the remains of a man who devoted his life to his family. In the fourth call, she detailed her plans to have me declared mentally incompetent and move me into the cheapest facility we can find that will take Medicaid payments. She talked about selling my house and using the proceeds to pay for my care, but also about how much would be left over for David's benefit. In the fifth call, she admitted that she'd been forging documents and intercepting my mail, preparing for a guardianship proceeding that would give her and David complete control over my finances. She'd created fake medical assessments and falsified records to build a case that I was no longer capable of caring for myself. In the final call, she told me that David never really loved his father, that Harold had been a pathetic old man who held David back from reaching his real potential, and that she'd done David a favor by getting rid of that constant reminder of where he came from. "Your husband was a loser," she said with vicious satisfaction. "A blue-collar nobody who never amounted to anything. David was embarrassed by him, and he's grateful that I helped him see how much better his life could be without all that baggage dragging him down." By then, Robert had prepared a comprehensive legal strategy that would destroy Jessica's life systematically, methodically, and completely legally. "Mrs. Morton," he said, organizing the evidence files on his desk, "we're going to file both criminal and civil charges. Theft of property, elder abuse, extortion, fraud, violation of a deceased person's final wishes, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. But that's just the beginning of what we're going to do to her." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Your daughter-in-law works at First National Bank, correct?" "Yes. She's a loan officer there. Banks are extremely sensitive about employees who engage in theft and financial abuse, especially against elderly people. Her employer will be notified of all charges filed against her. She'll lose her job immediately, and she'll never work in banking again." "And David?" I asked, because despite everything, he was still my son. "David is a victim too, in some ways," Robert said thoughtfully. "But he's also an adult who participated in elder abuse and theft. He'll face consequences, but we'll focus primarily on Jessica since she was clearly the driving force behind all of this." "I don't want to destroy my son's life," I said. "I understand," Robert said gently. "But Mrs. Morton, your son allowed his wife to abuse his own mother and desecrate his father's remains. Sometimes consequences are the only thing that can wake someone up and show them who they've become." Robert also discovered that Jessica's crimes went far beyond stealing Harold's ashes. She'd been systematically preparing to defraud me for years. She'd forged documents, intercepted my mail, and created an elaborate paper trail designed to support false claims about my mental capacity. She'd been planning to have me declared incompetent, gain control of my finances, sell my house, and move me into the cheapest possible facility while keeping the majority of my assets for herself and David. "She's been planning to steal everything from you," Robert explained, showing me copies of documents Jessica had created without my knowledge. "The ashes were just the first step. She was going to systematically strip you of your autonomy, your property, and your dignity, and she was going to use the legal system to do it." But Jessica had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated me completely, assuming that age and grief had made me helpless and stupid. She'd counted on me being too confused or too ashamed to fight back. She'd believed her own narrative about confused old women who needed younger, smarter people to make decisions for them. She was about to learn how wrong she'd been. The day we filed the charges, Robert and I drove to Jessica's office at First National Bank. We'd prepared a comprehensive dossier of her criminal activity, including the recorded phone conversations, forged documents, and evidence of her systematic plan to defraud me. We requested a meeting with her supervisor and the bank's compliance officer. "We're here to report criminal activity by one of your employees," Robert told the bank manager, a nervous man in his 50s who clearly wasn't used to dealing with police matters. Jessica was called into the meeting, and I watched her face go white as Robert laid out the evidence, piece by piece. The theft of Harold's ashes, the extortion attempts, the forged documents, the planning for financial fraud, the recorded admissions of criminal intent. "Miss Peterson," the bank manager said when Robert finished his presentation, "you're suspended immediately pending the outcome of these criminal charges. Security will escort you out of the building, and you're not to return to bank property for any reason." Jessica looked at me with pure, undiluted hatred. "You vindictive old bitch," she hissed, forgetting that she was still in her workplace surrounded by witnesses. "You have no idea what you've just done. You have no idea how much you're going to regret this." "I know exactly what I've done," I replied calmly, looking her directly in the eyes. "I've made sure you understand that Harold mattered, that I matter, and that what you did was unforgivable. Security," the bank manager said firmly, and 2 guards stepped forward to escort Jessica out of the building. As she was led away, Jessica turned back to scream at me. "David will never forgive you for this. You'll die alone and forgotten, and no one will ever care." But I wasn't alone, and I wasn't forgotten. I was surrounded by people who respected me, who valued my dignity, and who understood that what Jessica had done was not just criminal, but morally reprehensible. As security escorted Jessica out of the bank, I felt Harold's presence beside me for the first time since they'd stolen his ashes. This was justice, the kind of justice Harold would have understood and approved of. This was just the beginning of making Jessica pay for every cruel word, every dismissive glance, every moment of disrespect she'd shown toward the man I'd loved and the life we'd built together. Within a week, word had spread through Jessica's social circle about the charges and her termination from the bank. Her friends stopped calling, not wanting to be associated with someone accused of elder abuse and theft. Her book club asked her to leave, claiming they couldn't have someone under criminal investigation participating in their activities. The country club where she and David played tennis suddenly found reasons to question their membership, pointing to moral character clauses in their bylaws. Jessica's carefully constructed social life, built on appearances and status, and the illusion of respectability, crumbled as quickly as mine had been dismantled when they stole Harold's ashes. But there was a crucial difference. Jessica deserved what was happening to her. David called me 3 days after Jessica was arrested, and he was sobbing so hard I could barely understand him. "Mom, please," he begged, his voice broken and desperate. "Drop the charges. Jessica made a mistake, but she's learned her lesson. If this goes to trial, it'll destroy her career permanently. She'll never be able to work in banking again." "Where are your father's ashes, David?" I asked quietly. Silence on the other end of the line. "David, where is your father?" "They're gone, Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry. They're really gone. Jessica told me they'd been scattered in a memorial garden, but when the police questioned her, she admitted she threw them away." "I didn't know, Mom. I swear I didn't know." "Then it's too late for Jessica to learn any lessons that matter," I said, feeling a mixture of sadness and satisfaction. "Please," David begged. "She's my wife. I love her." "She threw your father in a dumpster like garbage," I said, letting him hear the full weight of what that meant. "She called him a pathetic loser and said you were embarrassed by him. She planned to steal everything your father and I worked for and leave me to rot in the cheapest facility she could find. And you want me to protect her from the consequences of her own actions?" David was crying harder now. "I know she said terrible things, but she was angry and scared. She didn't mean it." "Yes, she did," I said firmly. "That was the real Jessica, David. That was who she is when she thinks no one important is listening. And you need to decide whether that's the kind of person you want to spend your life with." The criminal charges moved forward with devastating efficiency. Jessica was arrested and processed, her mugshot appearing in the local newspaper, along with a detailed article about elder abuse and theft from seniors. The article mentioned her former position at the bank, her educational background, and the systematic nature of her crimes against her elderly mother-in-law. Her former colleagues at the bank saw it. Her neighbors saw it. Everyone in her perfect social world saw exactly who she really was beneath the polished exterior and professional demeanor. But Robert and I weren't finished with Jessica yet. Not even close. "Mrs. Morton," he said during our next meeting, "we're going to file a comprehensive civil lawsuit for damages. Financial damages, emotional damages, and punitive damages for the particularly egregious nature of her conduct." "How much are we talking about?" I asked. "I'm thinking $750,000, Robert said, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Her actions caused you severe emotional distress, violated your husband's final wishes, destroyed irreplaceable property, and were part of a systematic pattern of attempted financial exploitation. A jury will be very sympathetic to a widow whose daughter-in-law threw her husband's ashes in a dumpster and called him a pathetic loser. $750,000 was more money than Jessica and David had, more money than they could possibly raise. Their house was mortgaged to the limit to support their expensive lifestyle. They'd been living beyond their means for years, trying to maintain an image of success and sophistication that they couldn't actually afford. Jessica's job at the bank had been their primary income source, and without it, they were drowning in debt. When Jessica's lawyer received the civil complaint, he immediately called Robert to discuss settlement options. "My client can't afford that kind of judgment," he said nervously. "Is there any possibility of reducing the damages or working out a payment plan?" "Perhaps your client should have thought about that before she threw an elderly woman's husband in the garbage and called him a pathetic loser," Robert replied coldly. "Mrs. Morton's husband worked 3 jobs to provide for his family. He deserves justice, and Mrs. Morton deserves compensation for what your client put her through." Jessica's world continued to crumble in spectacular fashion. Without her income from the bank, she and David couldn't afford their mortgage payments on the expensive house they'd bought to impress their friends. The country club membership was canceled for non-payment of dues. Jessica's car, a luxury sedan she'd leased to maintain her professional image, was repossessed when they couldn't make the payments. They had to sell furniture and jewelry and wedding gifts to pay for Jessica's criminal defense attorney. The life they'd built together, based on appearances and status and financial success, evaporated as quickly as Harold's ashes in that dumpster. Meanwhile, I was receiving calls and visits from other seniors who'd heard about my case and wanted to share their own stories of family abuse and exploitation. Mrs. Patterson from church had a nephew who'd been stealing from her checking account for months. Mr. Rodriguez down the street had a daughter who was pressuring him to sign over his house deed. Mrs. Chen from my book club had a son-in-law who was trying to get her declared incompetent so he could access her retirement savings. Word spread through the senior community that there was finally a lawyer who would take elder abuse cases seriously, who understood that older people deserved respect and protection rather than dismissal and condescension. Robert started taking on more and more of these cases, building a practice focused on protecting seniors from exploitation by their own family members. "Mrs. Morton," he said, "what you did is inspiring other people to fight back. You've started something important here, a movement that's giving voice to people who thought they had no power left." Jessica's criminal trial lasted 3 days, and every moment was devastating for her defense. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The recorded phone conversations played in open court revealed her callous disregard for Harold's memory and her deliberate, calculated plan to exploit and abuse me. Her own words, spoken in her own voice, convicted her more thoroughly than any prosecutor's argument could have. The theft charges were supported by Harold's will and my ownership of the ashes. The elder abuse charges were proven by her systematic campaign to isolate me and control my decisions. The extortion charges were documented in her recorded threats to cut off my relationship with David. The fraud charges were evidenced by the forged documents she'd created to support false claims about my mental capacity. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Jessica was sentenced to 18 months in prison, with the possibility of parole after 12 months if she demonstrated good behavior and completed counseling programs for financial predators. She was also ordered to pay full restitution for the emotional distress and property damage, plus court costs and attorney fees. During the sentencing hearing, I was allowed to give a victim impact statement, and I'd prepared my words carefully. "Your Honor," I said, standing at the podium and looking directly at Jessica as I spoke, "the defendant didn't just steal my husband's ashes. She tried to steal my dignity, my autonomy, and my son's respect for his father. She thought that because I was old and grieving, I would be an easy target. She thought I would accept abuse because I was desperate for family connection. She was wrong about everything. I paused, letting my words sink in before continuing. Harold Morton worked 3 jobs to give his son a good life. He sacrificed his health, his comfort, and his dreams to provide for his family. He deserved better than to be thrown away like garbage by someone who called him a pathetic loser. And every senior citizen in this community deserves better than to be victimized by people who think age makes us helpless or stupid. I looked directly at Jessica, who was crying in her orange jumpsuit, looking nothing like the polished professional who'd once intimidated me with her education and her sophistication. The defendant tried to erase my husband from our family's history because his working-class background embarrassed her. She planned to steal everything he and I worked for and leave me to die alone in the cheapest facility she could find. She thought she could get away with it because I was old and confused and grateful for whatever scraps of attention she decided to give me. Jessica was sobbing now, but I wasn't finished. But age brings wisdom as well as vulnerability, experience as well as frailty, and sometimes the people who look weakest are actually the most dangerous to cross. The defendant learned that lesson, and I hope other predators who target seniors will learn it too. Jessica went to prison the following week, and David filed for divorce before she was even transported to the correctional facility. He couldn't handle the shame, the financial destruction, and the knowledge of who he'd married. Their friends sided with David, viewing Jessica as the one who'd brought disgrace to their social circle. Jessica's family, wealthy and image-conscious, disowned her completely, rather than be associated with her criminal conviction. But the most satisfying moment came 8 months later, when Jessica was released on parole and trying to rebuild some kind of life from the wreckage of her own making. I was having lunch at the diner downtown with Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Chen, discussing the success of our Elder Rights Foundation, when I saw Jessica walk in. She'd aged years in just months, her hair poorly cut and showing gray roots, her clothes cheap and ill-fitting, her face gaunt from stress and institutional food. She saw me sitting in my booth and started to leave immediately, but I called out to her. "Jessica," I said calmly, "come sit with me for a moment." She approached reluctantly, looking defeated and scared, like a dog that had been kicked too many times. "How are you doing?" I asked, genuinely curious about what had become of the woman who'd once seemed so powerful and intimidating. "I'm managing," she said quietly, not making eye contact. "I'm living with my sister in Springfield. I'm looking for work, but—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "But nobody wants to hire someone convicted of elder abuse and theft," I finished for her. She nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. "I've applied at dozens of places. As soon as they run a background check, they withdraw the offer. I can't even get a job at a fast food restaurant." "Good," I said simply, and without apology. Jessica looked shocked at my directness. "You tried to erase Harold from David's life," I continued calmly. "You threw my husband away like he was nothing and called him a pathetic loser. You threatened to isolate me from my only son unless I let you steal everything I owned. You thought I was weak and helpless and stupid, and you planned to destroy my life for your own financial benefit." "Mrs. Morton, She started to interrupt. "I'm not finished," I said firmly, using the same tone she'd once used with me. "You're going to spend the rest of your life explaining to potential employers why you have a criminal record for abusing a senior citizen. You're going to live with the knowledge that everyone in this town knows exactly who you are and what you're capable of. You destroyed your marriage, your career, and your reputation because you thought you could abuse an old woman without consequences." Jessica was crying openly now, but I felt no sympathy for her. She'd made her choices, and now she was living with the results. "But here's the thing, Jessica," I said, leaning forward slightly. "I'm not angry anymore. I got exactly what I wanted. Harold's memory has been vindicated. You've been punished appropriately for what you did. and I've learned that I'm much stronger and more capable than anyone, including myself, realized. I stood up to leave, but then turned back to deliver my final message. Oh, and Jessica. David visits me every Sunday now. We talk about his father. We share memories. We honor Harold's legacy together. David has learned to appreciate the man who raised him, and he's learned what real love looks like compared to what you were offering him. So thank you, in a way. You brought my son back to me by showing him exactly what kind of person he didn't want to become. Jessica was still crying when I left the diner, and I felt nothing but satisfaction at seeing her reduced to the pathetic figure she'd once called my husband. David did start visiting regularly, and our relationship slowly healed as he came to understand how far he'd strayed from the values Harold had tried to teach him. The divorce and Jessica's crimes had shocked him into realizing what he'd lost when he let her control his relationships and his priorities. We began having long conversations about Harold, sharing memories that Jessica had discouraged, and stories that David had forgotten in his rush to embrace her version of success and sophistication. I told him about Harold's pride in David's achievements, about the sacrifices his father had made, about the love that had motivated every difficult decision Harold had ever made for his family. 6 months after Jessica's sentencing, David asked if we could have a proper memorial service for Harold. We gathered in the backyard of our old house, the one Harold and I had shared for 45 years, with a small group of people who had truly known and loved Harold. David brought photos and told stories about his father that he'd been too embarrassed to share when Jessica was controlling his narrative. We planted an oak tree in Harold's honor, using soil mixed with some of his ashes that I'd managed to save from the bottom of the wooden box before Jessica destroyed the rest. It wasn't the memorial Harold had specifically requested in his will, but it was filled with love and respect and genuine appreciation for the man he'd been. David finally understood what he'd lost when he let Jessica isolate him from his father's memory, and he was determined to honor Harold's legacy in the years to come. Robert and I used the settlement money from Jessica, the full $750,000 that the civil jury awarded me, to establish the Harold Morton Foundation for Elder Rights. We provide free legal assistance to seniors facing abuse from family members, caretakers, or anyone else who targets them because of their age or perceived vulnerability. Robert runs the legal clinic, and I serve on the board of directors, sharing my story at community events and encouraging other seniors to speak up when they're being mistreated. We've helped dozens of families already, recovering stolen money, preventing unwanted institutionalizations, and prosecuting family members who thought they could get away with elder abuse. The foundation has become a model for other communities, and I've spoken at conferences and senior centers across the state about the importance of fighting back against those who would take advantage of older people. Every success feels like justice for Harold and validation that speaking up was not just the right choice, but the only choice that would have preserved our dignity and his memory. I still live in our house, the one Harold and I shared for all those years, and I intend to stay here for as long as I'm able. David helps me maintain it, and we've created new memories while honoring the old ones. Jessica had tried to force me into a facility where I would have been just another forgotten old person waiting to die, but instead I'm living a life full of purpose and meaning, using my experience to help other people find their voices and their strength. The oak tree we planted for Harold is growing strong in the backyard, its branches reaching toward the sky, just like Harold always reached for something better for his family. Sometimes I sit under it with my morning coffee and tell him about the foundation, about the people we've helped, about David's visits, and how proud Harold would be of the man our son has become after learning from his mistakes. Sometimes I tell him about Jessica, too, about how she's struggling to find work and rebuild a life that she destroyed through her own cruelty and greed. I tell him how the woman who called him a pathetic loser is now working at a convenience store in another state, living in a small apartment, still trying to convince employers to give her a chance, despite her criminal record. David met someone new last year, a woman named Sarah, who works as a nurse and volunteers at the animal shelter on weekends. She treats me with genuine respect and kindness, asks thoughtful questions about Harold and our family history, and seems to understand that honoring the past is part of building a meaningful future. It's a completely different kind of relationship than the one David had with Jessica, built on mutual respect and shared values, rather than manipulation and social climbing. Sarah has helped David understand what healthy love looks like, love that doesn't require him to abandon his family or forget where he came from. She encourages his relationship with me and often joins us for our Sunday visits, bringing homemade cookies and genuine interest in our family stories. The contrast between Sarah and Jessica couldn't be more stark, and I think David finally understands the difference between a partner who builds you up and one who tears down everything that came before her. Sometimes people ask me if I feel guilty about destroying Jessica's life so completely. The answer is always no, and I tell them exactly why. I didn't destroy Jessica's life. Jessica destroyed her own life when she decided to abuse a grieving widow and desecrate a good man's memory for her own convenience and profit. I simply made sure there were appropriate consequences for her choices. Jessica thought she could target me because I was old and alone and grief-stricken. She thought she could steal from me, abuse me, and erase my husband's memory without anyone fighting back. She was wrong about everything, and the price she paid for her cruelty was entirely of her own making. Harold always used to say that silence isn't submission, it's strategy. For 2 years after his death, I was silent, while Jessica systematically isolated me from David and laid the groundwork to steal everything Harold and I had worked for. But I wasn't being submissive or confused or helpless. I was watching, learning, understanding exactly who I was dealing with and what she was capable of. When the time was right, when she finally revealed her true nature by stealing Harold's ashes and calling him a pathetic loser, I struck back with everything I had. I used the legal system. I used her own recorded words against her. And I used the very sophistication and education she was so proud of to destroy the life she'd built on cruelty and deception. What Jessica never understood is that love doesn't diminish with age. It intensifies. The love I had for Harold didn't make me weak. It made me dangerous to anyone who threatened his memory. The love I had for David didn't make me desperate for his attention. It made me determined to save him from a woman who was destroying his character and his connections to the people who truly loved him. The foundation continues to grow and help more families every year. We've expanded to offer financial counseling, legal advocacy, and emotional support for seniors who have been victimized by people they trusted. We work with law enforcement to train officers on recognizing elder abuse, and we lobby for stronger legal protections for older adults. Harold's legacy lives on not just in David's renewed appreciation for his father, but in every senior citizen who refuses to be victimized, every family that stays connected across generations, and every predator who thinks twice before targeting someone they assume is helpless. If you're listening to this, and you've ever been told you're too old to matter, too confused to make your own decisions, too weak to fight back against people who want to take advantage of you, I want you to know something important. They're wrong about everything. Age brings wisdom, experience, resources, and often a perspective that younger people can't understand or appreciate. Sometimes the best revenge is showing people exactly how capable and dangerous you still are when they threaten something you love. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that dignity has no expiration date, and leave a comment telling me about a time when you had to stand up for yourself or someone you love. Harold's ashes may be scattered to the wind, but his memory lives on in every senior citizen who refuses to be victimized, every family that honors their elders, And every person who understands that love and respect don't diminish with age. They grow stronger and more powerful with time. That's a legacy worth fighting for, and it's a battle I'll keep fighting for as long as I have breath in my body.